"Stop, who are you?" The shout thundered through the vast aircraft maintenance hangar in San Diego as Rear Admiral Matthew Kane suddenly removed his safety helmet, stood at rigid attention, and saluted a civilian inventory clerk. Just minutes earlier, a group of young sailors had been laughing, mocking the faint tattoo on the back of her neck, assuming it was nothing more than the logo of a motorcycle gang. They had no idea it was the emblem of an ultra-classified unit that had lost 8 out of its 12 members in a deadly mission. And the woman standing before them had once been one of them. Morning at the North Island Naval Base always began with a symphony all its own. The crash of waves against the pier, the wind carrying the sting of salt mingled with the sharp tang of jet fuel, and somewhere in the distance, the steady metallic rhythm of tools striking steel from the maintenance bays. But woven into that industrial chorus was another cadence precise, deliberate coming from a corner of the massive supply hangar where Emily Hart worked. On paper, she was unremarkable. A civilian contractor responsible for managing inventory for the F/A-18 squadron. Just one name among hundreds. Yet, to anyone paying attention, she moved through the aisles like a perfectly programmed machine. Not a wasted motion, not a single step out of place. A 40-pound parts crate went to the top shelf in her hands as easily as if it were a box of cookies. Day after day, it was the same. Sign the ledger, scan the barcode, seal the box. Repeat a dozen times until the clock struck quitting hour. Then she would leave the base, drive her aging silver sedan back to a small apartment in Chula Vista, eat dinner alone, no television, no Facebook, no Instagram. Her life was as orderly as the rows of shelving she tended, and just as quiet. The new sailors most barely out of high school looked at her the way one might regard a piece of fixed equipment on base. A woman approaching 40, hair pinned back in a neat bun, eyes carrying a constant fatigue. Sometimes they whispered, just loud enough to be heard, but not enough to be called out, "Warehouse warden, shelf sheriff." A few joked she must be training for the world championship of stacking boxes. Emily didn't react. Not because she didn't hear, but because nothing in it was worth an answer. She kept working, pencil tucked behind her ear, inventory list in hand. Every now and then, when she bent to lift a crate or reached for a high shelf, the collar of her coveralls would shift, revealing a faint shadow of ink at the nape of her neck. A circle enclosing outstretched wings, etched in sharp black lines. It wasn't like any fashionable tattoo. No roses, no Latin quotes favored by college kids. It was something else enough to make a few young sailors snicker and spin stories. A motorcycle gang emblem, a clan crest from Call of Duty. And each time she heard that laughter, Emily would simply tug the collar back up, eyes fixed on her checklist. If anything changed, it was the slight tightening of her jaw, too subtle for anyone to notice. None of them knew that, somewhere else, in another time, men had once bowed their heads to that tattoo. That it wasn't the mark of a game, but the insignia of a group who rarely lived long enough to tell their story. Outside the hangar doors, the wind from San Diego Bay swept in, carrying the distant call of a ship's horn. In the cold white light of the fluorescence, Emily Hart looked like any other warehouse worker. Faded coveralls, scuffed steel-toe boots, a lean but unremarkable frame. Except to those who had once stood beside her in a storm history would never record, they would never mistake her for anyone else. She remained silent, invisible amid the banter of the young sailors. But some things, once carved into the blood, never fade. And that tattoo hidden beneath the gray fabric was still there, like a secret waiting to be seen.
Welcome to Veteran Silent Story, where forgotten battles come alive in powerful tales. Subscribe now and honor the silence that shaped our freedom.
Audit day at the North Island Naval Base always carried its own particular strain of tension. Hangar floors were polished until they gleamed as if for a parade. Manifests were combed through down to the last decimal, and officers suddenly became uncharacteristically polite. But no one had expected the arrival of Rear Admiral Matthew Kane, a man in the Navy's logistics circles compared to an X-ray scanner. Wherever he looked, he found the flaw. Kane was not loud, tall and lean, with long, steady strides and eyes so cold they seemed capable of stripping the paint from an aircraft just by looking at it. Rumor had it that, during an inspection in Yokosuka, he spotted a misrecorded serial number on a component from more than 20 paces away. To him, numbers never lied, only people did. The inspection team moved through each section, from maintenance bays, to the fuel depot, to the technical records archive. With each stop, the air seemed to grow heavier. The officers walking alongside him began to show the telltale signs of unease, jaws tightening, shoulders tensing. By the time they stepped into the inventory warehouse, Emily Hart's domain, a few of them were taking deep, deliberate breaths, as though the scent of hydraulic fluid might somehow mask their anxiety. The warehouse chief, confident in Emily's precision yet unable to hide a trace of apprehension, made the introduction. "Sir, this is Miss Hart. She manages the entire civilian inventory for the squadron. Every single bolt in here, she knows exactly where it is." Kane gave a brief nod, his gaze sweeping over the towering shelves where thousands of crates and boxes stood in perfect alignment, an arrangement so precise it bordered on visual art. He seemed satisfied but said nothing. Emily, as always, kept working. She pulled a heavy crate from a low rack, her forearms tightening beneath the worn gray fabric of her coveralls. And then, in a motion so small no one else noticed, her collar shifted. The cold white glare of the fluorescent lights fell directly on the nape of her neck, revealing a shadowed black circle enclosing a pair of sharply spread wings. The lines etched deep, as though they had been there a lifetime. Kane stopped. His eyes froze on that tattoo. It was not the look of idle curiosity, it was the flash of memory returning in full force. Memories of something most of the world had never heard of. And of those who had, most were no longer alive. He removed his safety helmet, the movement deliberate, holding it to his chest like a ritual. The entire team halted. The quiet tapping of pencils against clipboards ceased. No one understood what was happening. They only saw the famously cold admiral suddenly standing at attention in a way that felt different. His voice, low but so clear it carried across the warehouse, broke the silence. "That is the Valkyrie cipher." The air turned to ice. The young sailors who had been mocking Emily just days earlier stood frozen, as though caught committing a forbidden act. Somewhere in the back, someone muttered, What's Valkyrie?" But no answer came. Emily did not turn around. Her hands still gripped the crate as she set it on the inspection table with her usual care. But a single muscle in her jaw twitched. She knew that look. It had been a long time, but she remembered it well. The look of survivors recognizing each other by a sign that required no words. The Valkyrie cipher was no trendy tattoo. It was the seal of a unit that did not exist on paper. 12 had worn it. 8 lay forever in places the maps did not mark. And one of the remaining 4 was now standing in front of Kane, her hands still stained with steel dust and the smell of machine oil. Kane lowered his helmet. His eyes were no longer those of an auditing official but of a soldier standing before a sacred emblem. He knew that if this mark appeared here, it was no coincidence. And if she was indeed who he thought she was, everything was about to change. In the vast warehouse, the fans still whirred, the metal still rang. But for those present, it was as if the world had tilted ever so slightly. They didn't know why, but they sensed deep down that the woman before them was not merely the warehouse warden. There are names that never appear on the evening news, yet are etched deep into classified files read by only a select few. Valkyrie was one of those names. No designation, no official insignia, no presence on any organizational chart. 12 individuals, hand-picked from across the branches of special operations, forged into a single unit with the skills to infiltrate, rescue, and vanish before anyone could understand what had happened. Each member carried a code name, a story, and a single tattoo. A black circle encasing a pair of outstretched wings, inked with lines as sharp as a blade cut into stone. Only 12 had ever worn it. Now, only 4 remained alive. Emily Hart had been known in that world as Spectre. Not because she enjoyed hiding, but because she was so skilled she could disappear in plain sight, even when standing just a few steps from her target. Many of her missions were never reported. They simply slipped into the dark, as though they had never happened at all. Then came nightfall, the Persian Gulf, 5 years ago. On paper, it was nothing more than an intelligence-gathering operation. But Emily and her team knew something was wrong from the very first step. The intel had been compromised, the exfiltration routes cut off, and instead of a single target, they faced an entire network lying in wait. When night fell, 8 of them never got back up. Only 4 survived, each scattering in a different direction. 2 were pulled out, 1 vanished, and 1 Spectre disappeared completely. No discharge papers, no farewell, just a single line in the report. Operation concluded. Asset inactive. Location unknown. Kane knew better than anyone. He was the one who had signed the deployment order for Nightfall, based on intelligence he later learned had been manipulated. Every face from that unit had become a cut in his memory. And perhaps the deepest cut of all was Spectre's the one who never returned to hear his apology. For 5 years, Kane had never sought her out. Not because he couldn't, but because he understood. Someone like Spectre did not want to be found. If she had vanished, it was because she had chosen to bury it all. But now, everything had changed. Not because of an order from the Department of Defense, not because of a new Black Ops mission, but because a man was desperate to save his daughter. Dr. Robert Mallon, a bioweapons scientist, had been reported dead alongside Valkyrie during the night of Nightfall. In truth, he had survived by vanishing under another name. And just last week, he surfaced in Houston, carrying information on a new generation of nerve toxin, something that, in the wrong hands, could kill millions. Mallon said he would hand the data to one person only. The one who had shadowed him through that chaotic night, the one he knew only by her codename Spectre. Kane had no choice. He trusted no one in the current network, especially when he knew it had been compromised from the inside. The only way to get Mallon and his daughter out alive was to find Emily Hart. There was just one problem. Emily was now simply the warehouse lady at the base, living quietly in Chula Vista, seemingly severed from her old world entirely. No weapons, no contacts, no trail for anyone to follow. Kane knew that if he took even one wrong step, she would vanish again, and this time, it would be forever. In the instant he saw that tattoo under the fluorescent lights, Kane understood that his only chance was standing right in front of him. But how do you convince someone who has chosen the shadows to step back into the place that took everything from them? In another corner of the warehouse, Emily stacked the last crate neatly into place, unaware that the walls she had built around herself for the past 5 years had just begun to crack. The conversation took place in a quiet corner of the warehouse, yet the air between them was as thick as if they were standing in the eye of a storm. Kane spoke briefly, without circling around, like a man who had waited far too long to say these words. The name Robert Mallon stirred no pleasant memory for Emily, only a shadowy figure in the darkness of nightfall and the echo of gunfire somewhere far away. Now he was alive. Not just alive, but carrying a secret that could shake the entire world. The formula for a new nerve toxin, a substance so lethal that just a few grams could turn a city into a graveyard. Mallon had declared he would hand the data over to Spectre. Not to the military, not to an elite strike team, but to her. Emily stood still, her eyes like a deep lake, unmoved by the wind. Then her answer came firm, cold. She was done. Her war had ended long ago. Kane wasn't surprised, but he did not look away. Throughout his career, he had learned to read the silences in people, and this silence weighed more than most. He knew he needed a decisive blow, something that could pierce the armor she had built over the last 5 years. He spoke of Malon's daughter, 7 years old, with her father, and the hunters would not spare her. The impact did not come immediately, but Kane saw something stir at the corner of Emily's eyes. It could have been the faces of those who had marched into darkness with her. It could have been the ragged breathing of someone over the radio when everything in Nightfall fell apart. It could have been the memory of another child's eyes she had once sworn to protect. Emily turned away, as if the fluorescent light above had suddenly grown too bright. Part of her wanted to walk out that very moment, to leave Kane and everything he represented behind. But the image, the little girl, 7 years old, knowing nothing of the world, clung to her like a shadow. She drew in a deep breath. The past did not rest. It only lay still, waiting for a reason big enough to rise. Kane said nothing more, did not press. He knew that in these moments, silence carried more power than any argument. Only the steady hum of the ventilation fans, and somewhere in the distance the faint clang of metal from another corner of the hangar. Finally, Emily turned back. The look in her eyes was no longer that of the warehouse lady on base. There was a change, almost invisible, but Kane recognized it instantly, the cold focus of an operative weighing a mission. "One time," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear. "Only this time." It was not an ordinary agreement. It was a contract, a binding clause between two people who had once stood on opposite ends of a tragedy, now looking toward the same objective. Kane nodded, slowly, as though afraid a hurried motion might shatter this fragile accord. Emily asked nothing of the details, nothing of the plan. It wasn't time yet. She only knew that if she had said one time, she would see it through, no matter the cost. Outside, dusk settled over the base. The sound of waves from San Diego Bay drifted in, a reminder that time was moving. They both left the warehouse, each carrying a piece of the past that had never truly closed. Emily walked toward her car, feeling as if a thin veil had just been torn away, exposing something she had tried to bury. Kane watched her go, fully aware that from this moment on, the wheel had begun to turn and it would not stop until the mission was done. 3 days later, deep inside the Pentagon, a windowless room glowed under a cold, unfeeling light. On the table, each firearm lay neatly in place like instruments waiting for the musician's hands. Emily, now once more Spectre, sat before them, her movements slow but certain. Fingers drifted along barrels, tested the smooth slide of the chambers, gripped the stocks as if feeling for the heartbeat of an old friend. Beside them sat forged passports, each carrying a name, a nationality, and an invented life story, an encrypted phone, a palm-sized listening device, a folding knife with a blade thin as moonlight. She worked in silence, no wasted motion, as if she had never left this world at all. This mission was unlike any she had taken before, not to destroy, not to capture, but to pull a man and a child from the tightening snare around them. Malon and his daughter Lila were hiding in New Orleans, a city of jazz, rum, and narrow streets carved with shadows. But it held something else. Argos. Argos was no government agency. It was a private intelligence syndicate, steered by Elias Thorne, an ex-CIA official with eyes like the edge of a dagger. He hunted not only for money, he hunted for power. And Malon, along with the data he carried, was the most valuable prize on his board. Spectre entered New Orleans as an art collector. A cream linen dress, oversized sunglasses, a leather crossbody bag stuffed with auction catalogs. She walked the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter, blending into the tide of tourists, snapping photos and eating beignets. From time to time, she paused at a gallery window, just long enough for Argos to believe they were watching a harmless traveler. But she saw everything. 2 men in Hawaiian shirts on the far corner, earpiece wires tucked beneath their hat brims, a black SUV parked exactly 1 block from the French market, and a couple pretending to shop for souvenirs but never taking their eyes off a single point. The net was not drawn too tight, a mistake made by hunters convinced their prey was already worn down. The opportunity came on a damp morning, when mist from the Mississippi drifted through the stalls of the French market. Spectre sat at an outdoor cafe, a steaming espresso in front of her, eyes sweeping each entrance. And then she saw it, a red balloon floating above the crowd. Beneath it, a dark-haired girl walking beside a man she recognized instantly, Malin. He was thinner than she remembered, but his eyes held the same quiet vigilance. Spectre rose and slipped into the current of people. When she was close enough, she spoke a single sentence in a language only the two of them had ever shared. Malin gave the smallest nod, his shoulders easing as if shedding a few pounds of weight. Lila looked at her with open curiosity, unaware this woman was her living shield. The relief lasted only seconds. Malin's voice was low. The data he carried was only half. The rest was held by a journalist, someone hiding far beyond Argos's reach. And he would give it to no one until Lila was out of the United States. Spectre understood instantly. This was not a simple get-them-out operation. It was a two-step game, each step with the power to collapse the whole. She glanced over her shoulder and saw one of the Hawaiian shirtmen break position, his hand pressed to his earpiece. Time was running out. She took Lila's hand, returning the red balloon as a silent signal. From now on, you do not let go. Malin stayed close behind, head lowered like any tourist seeking shade. They exited the market through a narrow alley onto Decatur Street, melting into the press of bodies around a street band's brassy rhythm. Argos was still there, but not yet moving in. Spectre knew the next move would be where things truly turned dangerous. And this time, if she miscalculated, it would not be one life that paid the price, but two. Spectre's plan was not a detailed map, with dozens of contingency routes. It was more like a thin wire stretched across a chasm. One wrong step, and everything would plunge into the abyss. But that was the kind of plan she trusted. Simple, audacious, and aimed straight at the blind spot of the enemy. The only way out for Lila was the Mississippi River. Its murky brown waters, heavy with the smell of silt, would carry the girl to the Gulf and from there into safe territory. Spectre knew an old fisherman in Chalmette, a man she had once saved from an arrest in Honduras. He owed her a life, and in this world, debts like that were never forgotten. But the Mississippi was not something you could approach freely. Argos had eyes on every dock. The only way to get Lila aboard was to make them look elsewhere. That night, as New Orleans drowned in light and the wail of jazz horns, a fire erupted in the warehouse district east of the city. Flames devoured the darkness, black smoke coiling upward like a towering pillar. At the same time, police received an anonymous tip about a foreign hostage being held there. Minutes later, Argos's network shifted, their entire force flooding east. While the city's gaze was fixed on the inferno, Spectre quietly led Lila to the Chalmette pier. The girl clutched the red balloon now tied to her backpack as a signal no dockhand could mistake. The fisherman's boat slipped away before dawn's first light. Lila looked back, her eyes wide, but she did not cry. Malin stood on the pier, hands clenched, eyes locked on the vessel until its light vanished into the river mist. Spectre touched his shoulder, her voice low but steady. Now it's our turn. They left the pier, moving through streets still damp with morning fog toward St. Louis Cathedral, a white-faced, triple-spired landmark stabbing into the gray sky. This was the meeting point, with the journalist holding the rest of the data. In this space, history and shadow intertwined, and tonight it would witness an exchange known to no one but them. But Argos had tracked them. No noisy assault, no dramatic charge, only shadows slipping in from narrow alleys, the whisper of rubber soles on stone, so quiet it was almost unnatural. In the chapel, candlelight flickered against the saint's statue, casting deep pools of darkness. Spectre sensed the movement before she saw it. When Argos's commander stepped from behind a stone column, hand on the grip of his weapon, she was already within striking range. Her strike came like lightning, a sharp arm sweep that dropped him before he could draw. The sound of his body hitting the floor was barely more than a book falling onto carpet. She didn't pause to admire the work. She slipped out through a side passage, merging into the growing crowd of tourists, spilling into Jackson Square. Malin received from the journalist a USB drive so small it could be hidden in the palm of his hand. The two halves of the data were finally together. He said nothing, only gave the messenger a nod, a gesture equal parts gratitude and farewell. Outside, a black SUV with Navy plates idled at the curb. As Malin climbed in, the first light of morning spilled across the cathedral's roof, washing the square in pale gold. Spectre did not join him. She had already vanished into the narrow back streets, as if she had never been there at all. Argos would keep hunting, but tonight's quarry had slipped beyond their reach. And somewhere on the Mississippi, a red balloon still drifted lazily, carrying with it a promise that had been kept. 48 hours later, the Norfolk Naval Base lay in the quiet calm of an autumn morning. On Rear Admiral Kane's desk sat a report barely 10 pages thick, yet its weight was enough to alter the fate of millions. The data Malin and the journalist had brought back had been decrypted. Federal agencies had moved immediately to neutralize the threat. A bioweapon that had never quite come into existence was now buried forever. Malin and Lila, under witness protection, had been relocated to Canada. There, among the blazing red maples, they reunited with what remained of their family, a new beginning, far from the shadows that had been hunting them. Kane closed the file and looked out the window, where autumn leaves spun in slow spirals, knowing his part was done. And Emily Hart? She kept the promise she had made from the start. She did not return to the unit. She allowed no one to pin a medal on her chest. There was no celebration, no speech of praise. On the day she left Norfolk, she left nothing behind but a thin envelope for Kane, with a single line inside. "Thank you. See you in another life." A month later, Emily appeared on the coast of Oregon. No one in the small seaside town knew of Spectre, or Valkyrie, or Nightfall. They only saw a woman nearing 40, renting a small wooden house facing the Pacific and taking a job at the local weather station. Her new work was simple: measure wind speed, record rainfall, and occasionally radio the center when a storm approached. Each morning, the crash of waves against the cliffs woke her before the alarm. Seagulls cried hoarsely overhead. Emily stood on her balcony, a mug of hot coffee in hand, watching the mist lift from the surface of the sea. No helicopters, no commands over the radio, no ticking countdown. Only wind, waves, and the stillness she had once believed she would never find again. Then one autumn afternoon, when the air had turned crisp and the maples began painting the road to the shore in gold, a small envelope appeared in her mailbox. No return address. Inside was a postcard. On the front, a photograph of a dark-haired girl, smiling as if she could embrace the whole sky, standing before a roaring white waterfall. In her hand was a red balloon, bright against the deep green of nature behind her. Emily turned it over. Just a few carefully written lines, in the rounded letters of a child's hand. "The sparrow's home. Thank you, Lila." No other words, but Emily needed none. She sat in the wooden chair on her porch, the postcard in her hand, letting the ocean wind run through her hair. A faint smile touched her lips, a warmth both near and far settling in her chest. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the nape of her neck, where the Valkyrie tattoo lay quiet beneath her sweater. For years it had been a mark of loss, a reminder of the Nightfall mission and the 8 who had never returned, but now it no longer carried the same weight. It had become the emblem of a promise to protect, even if it meant disappearing into the dark, and to keep that promise to the very end. Over the sea, the sunset began to pull a band of gold and crimson down to the horizon. Emily sat still, watching the sun sink, letting the waves and wind erase the last echoes of the past. The ghost could rest now, and if, one day, someone were to ask, "Who is Spectre?" perhaps the only answer would be, a woman who once kept her promise.
The muzzle flash of the M4, lit against the backglow of floodlights, reflected across Hannah Carter's face as she tapped lightly on the bolt carrier. hearing a faint click enough to know the rifle wasn't entirely sound. In the middle of the outdoor firing range at Camp Coyle, San Diego, she stopped firing, took a long breath, then smiled. A Navy SEAL stepped into view, throat dry, eyes following the path of each round, silently watching her. She turned. Having disassembled his HK 416-inch just 30 seconds, and he realized she was far more than just a gun hand. That moment marked the beginning of a journey that would redefine the meaning of respect and professional worth. In the morning, the wind from the Pacific curled across the southern firing range at Camp Pendleton, carrying with it the scent of salt water and the burnt tang of old gunpowder. Hannah Carter stood still, her back to the row of targets, sunlight slanting under the brim of her cap to cast a faint halo on the collar of her uniform, its edges faded from wear. She had just completed the first weapons inspection of the day load. Test, fire, recheck, a routine cycle, but never dull to her. It was now her third week assigned as technical support for the joint training between the Marines and SEAL Team 3, a position not meant to stand out, only to be precise, according to her orders. And indeed, Hannah hadn't stood out. She moved like a shadow between rows of equipment, always appearing before someone needed a weapon and gone before they could manage a thank you. The only problem was, no one thought she mattered. Most of the younger SEALs called her the bolt-turning lady. Some shook their heads when they saw her carefully measure the grip tension on a rifle stock as if tuning a violin. They weren't used to a brown-haired technician, barely 5'3", who could tell the exact revolutions of a drive bolt simply by hearing a click off by 1,000th of a second. To them, she was an anomaly, a strange deviation in the system. She didn't care. Each day, she arrived earlier than the watchman. She wiped every rail, aligned every red dot sight, tested each slide with the quarter she kept for that purpose, not to impress anyone. But because a life in the field often rested on a mere 1/10 of a second lost to a dust-jammed trigger, this morning, she heard the familiar murmur behind her again, a group of new guys chatting. One laughed loud enough to cut through the wind. "Hey, that tech girl can strip an M4 faster than swapping a tampon," the group chuckled. Hannah didn't turn. She simply set the HK 416 down on the felt mat, removed the bolt carrier group as if opening an old window, silent, precise. On her shoulder, her name patch still bore the faint residue of old glue. Carter, H. Blurred but steady. That was when the wind shifted. Heavy, measured footsteps sounded behind her, thudding lightly on the packed gravel. A large shadow fell across her. Without turning, Hannah already knew who was approaching. He was the only person here who could change the air in a room just by stepping into it. Sergeant Nathan Brick Callahan, SEAL Team 3's operational-level weapons maintenance chief, was spoken of as a living legend among Navy armorers. 6 deployments, 3 under-fire weapons repairs, twice fixing an M4 grip in the middle of a contact point. Some said Callahan could gauge a barrel's temperature from its echo. True or not, he'd earned the nickname Brick because, like a brick, he was unshakable, said little, and was always there to keep things from falling apart. Callahan wasn't one to smile, but today he stopped directly behind her, his rough voice breaking the quiet textured with black coffee and hundreds of hours in combat. "You've got the quarter facing the wrong way. Heads up makes it slip easier." Hannah turned. Callahan's steel-gray eyes weren't on her, but locked on the rifle. Yet in that gaze, something had shifted, not recognition, but the first step toward paying attention. She smiled, faintly, the way one nods to a familiar song on the radio. "Is that so? I figured a gun could use a little luck." No reply came, but the air was no longer the same. Can a single quarter break down the invisible wall between doubt and trust? You'll want to stay and see how it does exactly that.
Welcome to Veteran Life Stories, where real sacrifice meets unforgettable storytelling. Subscribe and keep their courage alive.
Hannah couldn't remember the first time she ever held a gun. She only remembered the smell of gun oil soaked into her memory like a fragment of childhood scent, that slick, cold, and strangely clean aroma. Summer evenings in the suburbs of Phoenix, when the neighborhood kids were still splashing water in their backyards, she would sit cross-legged beside her father, under the dim yellow glow of a lone fluorescent bulb hanging from the porch, listening to the click of metal sounding steady as an adult's heartbeat. Her father, James Carter, was a veteran weapons technician with the Desert Rangers, a volunteer paramilitary group specializing in counter-narcotics operations along the Arizona-New Mexico border. He wasn't the talkative type, but each time he stripped down an AR-15, he seemed to become a silent storyteller, steady, deliberate, every motion carrying a message, discipline, detail, and respect for the tools that protect life. A good bullet is the quietest soldier in a fight. He said that when she wasn't yet tall enough to reach a crate of ammunition, Hannah didn't fully understand it back then, but later she realized her father wasn't just teaching her technique, he was teaching her how to be silent and still have worth. She learned to feel a weapon with her fingertips, the way a craftsman feels the grain of wood. When you clean the carbon off a bolt carrier, you can tell who last used the weapon and whether they trusted it. A clean rifle, straight firing with a smooth trigger, was a kind of promise, and in a chaotic world, sometimes that promise was the only thing standing between life and death. Of course, the neighbors didn't see it that way. A girl with guns? You joining the mafia or something? One nearby mother had thrown that line when she caught Hannah cleaning a barrel instead of playing with dolls. The kids were kinder, but not without side eyes every time she brought empty shell casings to school to make decorations. Few understood that to Hannah, an empty casing wasn't a symbol of violence, but of a mission completed. The jabs didn't make her rebel, they just made her quieter. She retreated into a world of her own where every detail had a reason, where every margin of error had consequences. Ironically, the better she got, the more she was pushed aside. In high school, she won first place in a simulated M16 assembly competition, but the gym teacher flat out told her, "You should try out for the girls' baseball team, leave the guy stuff alone." That was the first crack in Hannah's understanding between actual ability and how people treated it. She wasn't angry, not deeply sad either. But with every bolt she tightened, every barrel she polished until it mirrored the light, she poured into it something she couldn't quite say aloud, the quiet kindness of those who choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. When she grew up, Hannah didn't choose a traditional college. She applied to the military's technical support program, completing all mechanical proficiency tests in half the standard time. Her instructors called her Ghost Wrench because she finished before others had even begun. By the age of 23, she had worked on more than 80 different weapon systems, from simple pistols to heavy machine guns mounted on armored vehicles. But everywhere she went, the same look followed: skepticism first, acceptance later, and sometimes nothing at all. Camp Pendleton was no different. Only, this time, Brick Callahan's gaze lingered a fraction longer. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time in years, someone was noticing without her having to speak first. Comment 1 if you think this story is worth it, so we know you're still here. That morning began like any other, at Pendleton's sunlight slanting in, gravel crackling under the boots of Marines, and the familiar burnt smell from the firing line. The guns not yet cooled from the previous day's drills, but in the air, there was something slightly different, quieter, a little tighter. Hannah sensed it before she saw them. SEAL Team 3 arrived like a low-pressure front, not loud, but every movement carried weight. They stepped into the technical bay as if the floor had just turned into the deck of a warship. Their eyes swept over each rifle on the racks, hands reaching out, no introductions needed. And then he appeared, the young operator, with a stance that seemed to shorten time by sheer presence. He was the team's lead marksman, holding his HK-416 with the ownership of an artist cradling an antique Italian violin. Each step was a note in the silent symphony that special operations units had long since mastered. Hannah stood not far away, drying the fourth operating rod of the day. Light slanted through the window, falling directly on her wrist, where a small scar remained from hot oil splattering her 3 years ago. She looked up, quietly observing. The marksman approached, tested the trigger, tilted the HK-416, then gave a brief nod. He was about to leave when Hannah spoke, not loudly, not softly, but at exactly the frequency that makes a person stop. "Do you hear that?" He turned, brow furrowed. No one else in the room reacted, but Hannah had already placed a quarter on the HK's bolt carrier channel, giving it a light shake. The sound that came wasn't metal on metal, it was a faint, dry clink, just slightly offbeat. She didn't wait for a response. Her hands moved like a precisely programmed machine, removing the buffer tube, opening the bolt carrier group, separating the chamber, each motion as exact as if performed by a finely tuned assembly line robot. In under 30 seconds, the rifle lay neatly disassembled on the mat, each component aligned, clean as if it had just left the Heckler & Koch factory floor. She pointed to the back face of the hammer, a small, irregular wear mark so minor an untrained eye might mistake it for dust. But Hannah knew this was the beginning of stress fatigue, the kind that could lock a trigger after 20-30 rounds, especially when the barrel heated. The SEAL looked at her, then back at the rifle. His expression shifted from skeptical to startled, then into a quiet sort of acknowledgement that required no words. Hannah pulled out a tube of specialized lubricant, worked it into the contact point, then reassembled the weapon. She didn't need to look, she listened. When she slid the bolt into final lock, the clack rang out crisp, solid, and in the exact pitch she had memorized at the age of 9, under the dim fluorescent light in her Phoenix backyard. The marksman tested the trigger. His lips pressed together as if to say something, but instead he only nodded slowly. No praise, no handshake, just the rare silence between two people from different worlds, connected by a rifle that had just been brought back to life. The rest of the team saw it but said nothing. They didn't have to. In the military, there's a silent language only those who live at the edge of tolerances understand. It's when you watch someone save your life before you even knew you were about to lose it. Hannah turned away as if nothing had happened. She moved on to cleaning another rifle. But the quarter still sat there, catching the sunlight as if it knew it had just helped rewrite a perception. From across the room, Brick Callahan leaned against the doorway. He didn't intervene, but his gaze, deep, steady, and weighted, was marking something down, not on a report, but in memory. Camp Pendleton at night had a beauty of its own, cold, unyielding, like the soldiers who had passed through it. The sky was no longer blue but shaded into the ash gray of lingering gun smoke. Overhead, the halogen lights from the towers cast a harsh glare onto the rough gravel below, creating no shadows, only exposure. This was the most important drill in the training cycle, a simulated night assault in desert conditions, paired with an artificial sandstorm, a network of high-powered fans, combined with a specialized fine dust to recreate the battlefields of Afghanistan. No one liked it. It numbed the eyes, killed the radio, and destroyed weapons if anyone got careless about maintenance. SEAL Team 3 was split into two elements, advancing on the target from the north and southwest. Everything ran smoothly for the first 10 minutes, the sound of rifle stocks brushing against armor, silent hand signals in the haze, and the familiar mechanical clicks of rounds chambering amid air, thick with machine wind and burnt oil. Then it happened. A dry click rang out. Not the usual sound of a round being chambered, but something off, short of breath, like a whispered warning from the weapon's own body. The lead marksman, the same operator Hannah, had helped strip down an HK 416 the day before stopped. He tried cycling it again, but the trigger was locked, unmoving. The underbarrel grenade launcher was dead as well. Something was jammed or worse, broken. In the swirling dust, the worst thing wasn't the silence of a dead gun. It was the feeling of being left behind without explanation. The team was forced to shift, losing tempo, losing initiative. In a real engagement, that kind of error could have gotten the whole unit killed. On the perimeter, Hannah sat beside the mobile technical truck. She wasn't part of the drill formation, but as always, she stayed to watch. No one told her to. It was just, she didn't leave when things weren't finished. She heard that click, even from over 50 meters away, and knew it was bad. Without hesitation, Hannah slung her tool bag over her shoulder and pushed through the dust like a mechanic walking into the middle of the desert. No call, no permission. She reached the operator as he was struggling with the rifle. He was about to wrench the stock when Hannah placed a hand on the barrel, not stopping him, but with a clear enough signal, "Let me." Under the dim, dusty light, Hannah's hands didn't shake. She slid a cleaning rod into the gas system and extracted a clump of grit bound together by old oil, a result of a weapon that hadn't been properly flushed after the last drill. Next, she opened the buffer tube, separated the grenade launcher assembly, blew out the debris, reassembled. Every motion was deliberate, without excess or shortage. The whole process took no more than 2 minutes, but in that time, every other sound seemed to vanish. She no longer heard the wind, no longer saw the dust, only the steel, the oil, and the scent of sweat. Her movements were a refrain, each beat echoing from her childhood, from her father, from the nights spent beside an ammo crate under the porch. She didn't scold, didn't lecture. When the rifle cycled again, smooth and precise, she handed it back as if she had merely polished a glass someone had spilled. Then she turned and walked away, leaving a single boot print in the thick dust, the only one heading opposite the SEAL formation advancing toward the target. The marksman watched her go. He said nothing, but this time his eyes held not surprise, but something closer to gratitude and respect. The drill went on. The formation adjusted its route and completed the simulation on time. In the training report, no one mentioned the minor incident. No credit line was written, but everyone who had been there remembered. And at the weekend debrief, when a training officer asked, "Any suggestions for adjusting technical protocols?" Brick Callahan, the man who was always silent at the back of the room, spoke. "Next time, have Carter check it before we run the course." 1 sentence, 6 words. But for Hannah, it was the first oath she'd ever received that didn't need to be written. My dear viewers, stay tuned for the next part that will make you stop and marvel. Take a second to leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people joining us from all over the world. There was no award ceremony, no formal commendation, and no trumpet call when Hannah Carter stepped into the technical bay the next morning. But Camp Pendleton, like every training base that has witnessed the silence of courage, had its own way of saying that people had changed the way they saw you. That morning, the sky was slightly overcast. A cloud of ash drifted over the range. Hannah unlocked the armory door on time as usual, stepping inside expecting nothing but the familiar scent of old oil and the creak of worn hinges. But there was something unusual. Someone had neatly reorganized her toolkit, every screwdriver, every bottle of oil precisely in the order she kept them, though no one else had ever bothered to care. In the corner, Ghost, the SEAL marksman she had helped fix an HK 416-4, was cleaning his rifle. Light reflected off the metal surface like an unfinished portrait. He didn't look up immediately. Only when she passed by did he stop, turn, squint as if to see her more clearly, and then smile. A very small smile, restrained, almost hesitant, but clear enough. And it came with a nod. That was different. he said, not loud, not in a commanding tone, but the way someone speaks about a jazz piece unlike anything else, yet one that makes you stop in the middle of the street. For the first time, Hannah didn't feel like she was walking into a room full of eyes watching out of doubt. It was as if, finally, the frequency of those eyes had shifted. Tank, a demolition specialist built like a brick wall, who once scoffed that female techs only know how to read the manual, also approached. He handed over an FNX 45 pistol, asking Hannah's opinion on how to fine-tune the hammer for a quicker strike. Then, as if realizing he'd broken a rule, he shrugged. Haven't seen a tech this confident and sharp in a long time. Don't fix it for me, just tell me what I'm doing wrong. That's enough. From that day on, the change didn't come in a rush. It seeped into the air, into questions asked at the right moment, into the nameless respect for someone once dismissed as the girl who plays with guns. A new recruit stripping his rifle for the first time asked Hannah, "Which point should I oil first?" That question used to be for Ghost. Now, she was the one they looked to, not because she's a woman and she's good, but simply because she was good. Hannah still didn't speak much. She didn't need to. When someone asked her what lubricant she used for their worn-out saw, she simply handed them the exact green tube, offering a faint smile not to show off, but to say, "I understand." She still cleaned weapons each night, still worked with her quarter, still checked every mechanism as if war could break out tomorrow, but now, each step she took no longer echoed alone. Callahan, the one who used to just watch, began assigning preliminary checks to Hannah before each drill. Not quite a compliment, but trust turned into action. For men like him, that meant more than a handshake. Even the base's administrative office, which rarely cared for temporary techs, unexpectedly invited her to a meeting on upgrading the 2026 weapons maintenance protocols. Not because she was representing women, but because they needed someone with real-world insight, and her name came up as the one who saved the combat simulation from failure. In the mess hall, small taps on the shoulder began to happen. "Carter, that MP7 you tuned yesterday was perfect," or "Heard you know a trick to clean the hammer without disassembly. Willing to share?" Hannah responded simply, nod, demonstrate, then disappear before anyone could say thank you. For her, recognition didn't come from applause, but from people willing to pause, to ask, to listen. That was it. Enough. In a country like the United States, where technical roles are still underestimated when paired with gender, Hannah hadn't broken every barrier, nor become the face of a movement. But in a grueling SEAL unit, where every pull of the trigger decides life or death, she had made those who once thought she didn't belong stop, look, and adjust course. Do you think you can guess what happens next? Take a moment, comment number 1, or "I'm still here," to keep listening. The last day always carried a strange kind of quiet. Even though boots still thudded over the gravel, even though commands still barked over the internal radio, the atmosphere at Camp Pendleton that afternoon seemed coated in a layer of sunlit bronze dust, warm, still, and richer than usual. She stood alone behind the technical vehicle, where the gun mat she laid out every morning was spread perfectly squared, neither too much nor too little. The metal parts rested neatly, like chess pieces reset after a match. In the top left corner of the mat, as always, lay the familiar quarter. It bore a small scratch, now a nick along the edge from when it hit the concrete during a hurried maneuver in last week's simulated grenade drill. But today, looking at it, Hannah no longer saw a technical tool, no longer a marker or a way to calibrate sound. She saw a witness, a silent figure that had walked with her through a journey of doubt, dismissal, and the slow shift toward recognition. It had seen her hands accomplish what words never could. And now, it lay there like a quiet congratulation, simple, round, and weighted just enough. In the distance, the SEAL team was lining up for a group photo, A few glanced her way, each raising a silent thumbs up in turn. No names, no well wishes. In the military, there are acknowledgments never put to paper, but carved deeply into memory. Tank, the loud, muscle-bound jokester who loved to make cracks about guns and barbecue, this time simply walked past, leaving a clean, neatly folded gun cloth on her table. He said nothing. But in one corner of the cloth was a stitched line of green thread, the color signifying senior technician status in the team's unofficial hierarchy. Someone had sewn it, and he was the one to deliver it. Ghost, as usual, said nothing. He simply slung the HK-416 she had just fine-tuned, giving her a single nod. Perhaps he wanted to say something like, "Thanks for keeping me alive." But instead, he adjusted his sling to sit more snugly. In the language of warriors, that was already a poem. Then, as she was removing her technical jacket, the heavy fabric steeped in gun oil, sweat, and a touch of nostalgia, a figure approached. Not loud, not marked by rank. Just an older man in Air Force intelligence attire, the SOCOM TAC patch on his left shoulder. He handed her a plain white envelope, no sender's name, only a clean printed line, Advanced Technical Combat Program. She hadn't yet asked a thing when he nodded, answering softly. "We've reviewed your file and the field evaluations. You don't just fix weapons, you keep the fight alive." He paused for a beat, then spoke quietly, in what might be the most formal invitation the military could utter. "We want you in the Special Technical Training Program." Hannah looked at the envelope in her hand, then at the quarter. Her chest didn't surge the way books so often describe. No music swelled. There was only stillness. Like a freshly cleaned chamber, a round loaded with a soft click, and everything locking into place without a sound. She smiled faintly, not the smile of celebration, but of quiet agreement with herself. After all the time, the whispers, the glances, she no longer needed to say she was worthy. They had already said it for her in the way they looked, the way they acted, and the way they invited her to step through a new door. As the sunlight began to stretch long across the range, Hannah folded the technical mat for the last time. The quarter was placed in the center, wrapped in the cloth like something precious. No one saw. But she knew it would follow her into whatever came next. On the gravel, her footsteps made no sound, but this time, each one felt lighter. She had once been the girl who cleaned guns. Now, she was the one invited into the United States Special Operations Force's Advanced Tactical Program. Do you see how a small coin can bear witness to an entire life? Not everyone who holds a gun is a warrior. And not everyone who stands behind the line, quietly cleaning each tiny piece of steel, is someone forgotten. Hannah Carter's story reminds us that sometimes courage isn't found at the front lines, it's in the steady hands that keep the front from breaking. In a world that insists on labeling people by gender, role, and appearance, there are still those who choose to answer not with words, but with precise, quiet actions, and in the end, they move others. If you've ever been underestimated, ever endured in silence knowing you were skilled but unseen, then this story is for you. If you feel touched by it, leave a comment, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it. And don't forget to follow the channel, there are many more stories waiting to be told. We see each other in the small details, and those details sometimes are what save an entire battlefield.